At 5:47 a.m. on March 14, 1945, Private First Class Rodrigo Dodong Macaraig of the 14th Infantry Regiment, Philippine Commonwealth Army, crouched behind a collapsed nipa wall at the eastern lip of Barangay Sto, Tomas, Nueva Ecija, Luzon, facing a fortified Japanese garrison of approximately 340 soldiers entrenched in layered earthworks no more than 180 meters to the northeast. While a thin morning mist clung to the flooded rice paddies, between them like smoke that had not yet decided where to go. Cradled across his knees was a 4-foot section of mature Kawayang Tinik bamboo, walls nearly 1 inch thick, reinforced along 2 stress fracture points with salvaged telegraph wire and strips of dried rattan. The interior bore carefully smoothed with a heated iron rod, a weapon his commanding officer had dismissed as a peasant's fireworks tube just 72 hours earlier. The nearest friendly fire support, a single-point, caliber Browning crew, was positioned 220 meters to his left flank, across an open expanse of flooded paddy that Japanese observers could sweep in under 4 seconds. In the next 9 minutes, Macaraig would fire 7 improvised charges from that bamboo tube, and by the 8th minute, the Japanese eastern defensive corridor would cease to function as a cohesive fighting position. History, it turns out, does not always reward the man with the correct papers. Sometimes it rewards the man who understood what bamboo could do when no one else was paying attention. The record of what happened that morning was not declassified until 1961, and even then, the relevant pages of the 14th Infantry's after-action report carried a handwritten margin note from a U.S. Army liaison officer that read simply, "Confirm or deny bamboo mortar, Filipino PFC, 7 rounds, 1 corridor." The confirming signature below it belonged to Lieutenant Colonel Esteban Reyes, the man who had been most vocally opposed to allowing Macaraig's device anywhere near a live combat operation. What Rodrigo Macaraig accomplished on the morning of March 14, 1945, did not win the war. It did not appear in the major dispatches. His name does not appear on the bronze plaques at the Manila American Cemetery. But among the men of the 14th Infantry, among the farmers and schoolteachers and fishermen who had picked up rifles because there was nothing else to pick up, the story of Dodong and his bamboo launcher passed from campfire to campfire until it became something harder than bronze, a lesson. The lesson was elemental. The most dangerous soldier on any battlefield is the one who has been told he has nothing left to fight with. Before we dive in, I want to know, where are you listening to this story from? Drop your city or country in the comments right now. And let's see which corner of the world has the most war legend fans. Don't just scroll, type it out. Your comment might get featured in the next story. Rodrigo Dodong Macaraig was 23 years old in the winter of 1944, born and raised in the rice-farming municipality of Lor, Nueva Ecija, the third son of a tenant farmer who grew palay on land he did not own. He had completed 4 years of elementary school at the Lor Central School before family economics made further education an impossibility. At 19, he found work as a maintenance laborer for the Philippine National Railways, repairing track beds and culvert drainage along the Central Luzon line. He had calloused hands, a mechanical instinct refined through years of working with iron and timber in extreme humidity, and an ability to look at a broken object and understand without diagrams what had failed and why. He was not, by any measure that the Philippine Commonwealth Army used in its intake assessments of October 1941, a promising military prospect. He was inducted that same month and assigned to the 14th Infantry as a supply runner, the lowest operational role available to an enlisted man with no secondary education and no prior weapons training. His function was to transport ammunition crates, cooking fuel, and medical supplies between forward supply depots and forward rifle companies. He was not issued a formal combat role, not issued a field radio, and did not appear on the unit's combat roster in any capacity. In the blunt administrative language of the regiment's personnel ledger, he was a Category 3 support asset, non-combatant, non-essential. His immediate superior, Sergeant Benedicto Lara, described him in a 1946 oral history interview with characteristic plainness: quiet, always watching things, always touching things, like a mechanic looking at a broken engine. That observation, entirely unintentional as a character sketch, was the most accurate one anyone ever produced of Rodrigo Macaraig. He was constitutionally incapable of examining a problem without rotating it in his mind until he found the angle where a solution became visible. The bamboo launcher did not emerge from desperation. It emerged from observation. During the Japanese occupation, Makariag had twice watched Imperial Army soldiers employ what he later described in testimony as a short metal pipe on a stick to lob grenades across distances no human arm could bridge. He did not know the term spigot mortar. He had never opened a military engineering manual, but he grasped the underlying physical principle with the directness of a man trained by practical work rather than formal instruction. A confined charge propelling a projectile from behind will throw that projectile farther and harder than a limb. He spent 7 months between supply runs in the hours before dawn and after dusk, testing this principle with progressively refined bamboo tubes, improvised propellant charges packed into salvaged brass artillery casings, and stabilizing fins cut from flattened tin cans. His officers did not know about the tests. When they eventually found out, their reactions traced a spectrum from dismissive amusement to active hostility. Captain Arsenio Domingo, the 14th Infantry's operations officer, told Makariag directly in January 1945, "You are a supply runner. You run supplies. You do not build weapons. If I wanted a weapon built, I would ask an engineer." Makariag said nothing. He kept building. By early 1945, the strategic situation across Luzon had acquired a particular and brutal character. General Douglas MacArthur's return landings at Lingayen Gulf on January 9 had committed the U.S. 6th Army and its attached Philippine Commonwealth Army formations to a grinding northward push through the Central Plain, aimed ultimately at Manila and the mountain redoubts of northern Luzon, where General Tomoyuki Yamashita had consolidated the bulk of his remaining Shobu Group forces. The liberation of Luzon was not going to be clean or fast. It was going to be attritional. And at the tactical level, at the level of individual squads fighting for individual irrigation berms and road junctions, it was going to extract payment in blood for every meter gained. Japanese defensive doctrine in central Luzon had undergone a fundamental transformation between late 1944 and early 1945. The aggressive, forward-advancing tactics of the early occupation years were gone, replaced by a fortified defense strategy built around interlocking strong points, mutually supporting bunker complexes constructed from sandbags, bamboo matting, salvaged timber, and poured concrete where available, connected by covered communication trenches and pre-sighted, overlapping fields of fire. These positions were engineered to absorb frontal assault, punish flanking maneuvers, and make the cost of each forward movement prohibitive for attackers. Japanese engineers had studied 3 years of Pacific Island fighting and internalized a fundamental lesson. A well-constructed bunker complex forces the attacker to pay in casualties for ground the defender has already surrendered in territory. Every Filipino or American soldier who died approaching a fixed position was a calculation the Japanese could afford. The defensive corridor at Barangay Sto. Tomas was an instructive specimen of this architecture. The Japanese garrison occupying it, elements of the 2nd Battalion, 10th Independent Infantry Regiment, had spent nearly 3 months constructing a defensive line that ran approximately 600 meters along the eastern edge of the village. It was anchored at the northern end by a reinforced bunker complex built into the structural remains of a pre-war municipal warehouse, and at the southern end by a network of individual spider holes and connecting trenches dug into the elevated earthen berm of an old irrigation canal. The entire eastern face of the position was covered by at least 4 light machine gun emplacements and 2 Type 92 heavy machine guns, each sighted to generate overlapping fire lanes across the rice paddy approaches. The garrison's commander, a calculating and experienced officer, had positioned his weapons not at the obvious forward line but at staggered depths, so that the suppression of any single emplacement would not open a clean corridor through the whole. The 14th Infantry's tactical problem was simple to diagnose and deeply difficult to solve: to advance on the Sto. Tomas position from the west, the only viable direction of approach. A unit had to cross between 150 and 250 meters of open, flooded rice paddies with no meaningful natural cover. Standing water between shin and knee depth, combined with the soft mud floor of the paddies, reduced movement speed under fire to roughly 2 kilometers per hour, a pace that left attacking soldiers exposed in the open for minutes at a time, rather than seconds. The Japanese machine gun positions held clear, unobstructed lines of sight across the entire approach. Two previous Filipino assault attempts, launched on March 8 and March 11 respectively, had each been broken up before the leading elements reached the halfway point, resulting in combined casualties of 11 killed and 22 wounded across the two failed efforts. Artillery support, the tactically obvious solution to fortified bunker complexes, was intermittently available at best and effectively unavailable. For offensive use against Stowe, Tomas, the 14th Infantry's organic artillery element consisted of a single 75mm mountain gun that had been carried in disassembled sections through the Sierra Madre foothills and painstakingly reassembled by a crew that had been hand-hauling its components for 6 weeks. It was a testament to human stubbornness and mechanical ingenuity. It also had 17 shells remaining in its supply inventory. Firing against the Stowe, Tomas bunker complex risked damaging the barrel through overheating, and the resupply situation, dependent on the same stretched and prioritized logistics chain that served the entire central Luzon theater, meant that once those 17 rounds were expended, replacements were not guaranteed to arrive on any predictable schedule. Lieutenant Colonel Reyes had placed the mountain gun under strict conservation orders, reserved for emergency defensive use, not offensive operations. American fire support was theoretically reachable through liaison channels, but the 14th Infantry occupied the far eastern edge of the 14th Corps' operational zone, and the simultaneous competing demands on American artillery and close air support assets across the entire central Luzon campaign meant that direct support requests originating from Filipino Commonwealth units were routinely deprioritized in the allocation queue. The unit's U.S. liaison officer, 2nd Lieutenant Howard Krause of Baltimore, Maryland, was a 22-year-old replacement who had arrived at the regiment 3 weeks earlier and was still learning the terrain. He was earnest, hard-working, and almost entirely without the established relationships within the American fire support network that would have allowed him to push an urgent request up the chain and expect rapid action. The command solution, stripped of its tactical language, amounted to this: wait for assets that might not come, conserve the irreplaceable artillery, and avoid further frontal assault attempts until conditions changed. It was a rational assessment grounded in rational analysis of available resources. It was also the kind of decision that protracted wars translate into stalemate, and the men of the 14th Infantry had been in this war, with different degrees of intensity, since December 1941. They understood what waiting felt like. They also understood, with the specific and unfakeable knowledge of men who have watched friends die in flooded paddies without accomplishing anything, that something fundamentally different needed to happen at Stowe, Tomas. Rodrigo Macarag had an idea about what that something might be. The first formal presentation of the bamboo launcher to the 14th Infantry's command staff took place on February 28, 1945, at the unit's command post in a damaged schoolhouse 6 kilometers west of Stowe. Macarag had requested the meeting through Sergeant Lara, who agreed to bring the matter forward with the resigned air of a man who had already calculated the probable outcome. Macarag set the bamboo tube on the map table beside Captain Domingo's tin coffee cup and explained the device in methodical sequence. The propellant charge, housed in a sealed brass casing from a salvaged 75mm artillery shell, sat at the base of the tube. The improvised projectile, a cast iron fragment container packed with black powder and shrapnel nails, with a 3-second burning fuse, was seated above it. The full assembly was initiated by a pull-cord percussion cap mechanism adapted from a disarmed Japanese Type 97 grenade. Tested range, he said, was between 60 and 180 meters depending on propellant load. Lateral dispersion at 100 meters ran within a 5-meter radius across 41 test firings. Captain Domingo interrupted at approximately the halfway point of this explanation. "What is the rated pressure tolerance of your firing tube?" he asked. Macarag did not know the figure in engineering terms. He knew the tube had survived every test. He knew it had not failed. "You don't know," Domingo said flatly. "So your proposal is to stand behind an unrated pressure vessel and fire explosive charges from inside our perimeter among our own men." The meeting ended. Macarag was ordered back to supply duties and explicitly prohibited from conducting further weapons testing within regimental boundaries. But But the problem at Stowe, Tomas, did not resolve itself by waiting. On March 5th, a four-man scout team attempting to infiltrate through the southern irrigation berm at night encountered a Japanese flare-triggered response and lost 2 men before withdrawing. On March 8, the second frontal assault attempt, supplemented by a volunteer flanking element meant to draw machine gun attention, ran directly into a repositioned Japanese nest that had been moved overnight, demonstrating that the garrison was actively adjusting its defensive layout in response to observed Filipino approach patterns. The enemy was not static, it was learning and adapting. Morale in the rifle companies was not collapsing, but it was bending under sustained pressure. The 14th Infantry had experienced this slow, corrosive condition before, the grinding effect of a tactical problem with no available solution, where each attempted approach had been purchased in casualties and none had produced results. Soldiers develop a particular dark humor in these circumstances, and mockery of the bamboo launcher had begun filtering through the enlisted ranks with the efficiency that ridicule always achieves. An officer in the weapons platoon had reportedly referred to Dodong's garden hose as the regiment's secret weapon, and the phrase had spread with the speed of something that captures a shared frustration. Makarag heard the jokes. He responded to none of them. He continued his supply runs through the day, and continued refining the launcher in the evenings, adjusting propellant, loads, improving the stabilizing fin geometry on his projectiles, stress testing the percussion mechanism under varying humidity conditions. He was not visibly angry. He was, as several witnesses later independently described, simply focused in the particular manner of a man who knows he is correct and has decided that circumstances will eventually prove it without requiring him to argue. Sergeant Lara, who had evolved from skeptic to cautious observer across these weeks, said in his 1946 account, "Dodong never argued with anyone about the launcher. He just kept making it better. I think he understood that the argument would eventually make itself." By March 12, Lieutenant Colonel Reyes had privately acknowledged to his executive officer that the regiment needed something different at Stowe, Tomas. The artillery conservation order held. The American support request remained unanswered. A third frontal assault over the same ground would produce a third set of casualties against identical odds. Major Fortunato Cruz, the executive officer, reportedly said, "What about the supply runner with the bamboo thing?" Reyes reportedly said, "Not yet." By the evening of March 13, it was yet. The authorization came not through a formal order but through the kind of battlefield pragmatism that war eventually forces upon even the most doctrine-cautious commanders. On the evening of March 13, an aggressive Japanese patrol pushed past the berm line and struck a Filipino listening post 300 meters west of the main defensive corridor. 2 men from the post were killed before the patrol withdrew under covering fire. The action told Lieutenant Colonel Reyes 2 things simultaneously. The Japanese garrison was not passively waiting, and the current deadlock was producing casualties in both directions without strategic resolution. Something had to break the equilibrium before it eroded the regiment's combat effectiveness beyond recovery. At 9:15 p.m. on March 13, Sergeant Lara was summoned to the command post and informed informally, and with a notable absence of official documentation, that Private First Class Makarag and his equipment were authorized to accompany the following morning's reconnaissance in force. He was not assigned a formal operational role. He was told to keep his device available. Captain Domingo was present throughout the exchange and said nothing, leaving without making eye contact with Lara. Makarag was already awake when Lara found him. He was rechecking his propellant loads by lantern light, his fingers moving over the brass casings with the tactile certainty of someone who has performed a task so many times it has become indistinguishable from instinct. "Tomorrow," Lara told him. Makarag nodded once. He went back to his propellant loads. At 4 a.m. on March 14, well before first light, he was moving quietly through the pre-dawn dark with the launcher carried under one arm and a canvas bag holding 8 prepared charges slung from his opposite shoulder. He had made one final modification to the launcher the previous evening, a simple bipod of lashed bamboo stakes, which allowed him to set and hold the firing elevation angle without requiring an assistant to stabilize the tube, essential since he had not been assigned one. The bipod was rough, it was precisely functional. He had checked its angle geometry against a bamboo post driven into the ground at his estimated target distance, calculating the trajectory from first principles rather than charts. A computation built from hundreds of hours of watching thrown and dropped objects travel through air. At 5:30 a.m., the reconnaissance in-force element, approximately 40 Filipino riflemen moving in dispersed groups, began advancing toward the stow. Tomas' position under the cover of the remaining pre-dawn darkness, and the mist still sitting over the paddy. Macaraeg was positioned on the left flank near the paddy's western edge, accompanied by 2 riflemen who had been told in approximate terms what he was attempting. One of them, Private Aurelio Santos, later described the atmosphere at that moment. I didn't know if the thing would work. I didn't know if it would blow up in his hands. I only knew that if we walked across that paddy again without something new, we were going to die exactly the same way we had died before. At 5:47 a.m., first light was beginning to gray the eastern horizon. The mist persisted over the paddies. Japanese sentry movement at the forward berm was audible, low voices, the faint metallic sound of equipment adjusting, a brief shadow visible at the machine gun aperture. The garrison was alert and awake. Macaraeg set the bipod into the soft earth at the paddy's edge. He seated the first charge. He checked the firing elevation, approximately 42 degrees, his calculated optimum for a 120-meter engagement. He checked the percussion mechanism. He looked at the machine gun aperture for a long, still moment. Then he pulled the cord. The sound the bamboo launcher made was nothing like what anyone standing nearby had expected. The witnesses who were present described it differently, but with a consistency that suggests they were each trying to name the same unfamiliar thing. Private Santos said it sounded like a large drum struck hard from inside. Corporal Danilo Reyes, positioned 30 meters to the right, described a cough, something clearing its throat, then a low whistle. The launcher produced almost no muzzle flash. The propellant charge was too small and too contained for visible ignition, which meant that in the gray pre-dawn light and the dispersed mist, the firing position was functionally invisible to the Japanese sentries across 180 meters of open water. The first round fell short. It detonated in the flooded paddy approximately 8 meters before the berm, producing a contained, wet crack and a column of mud and water that rose 3 meters and collapsed. The Japanese position reacted within seconds. The machine gun at the eastern bunker swept a long burst across the paddy in the general direction of the sound. The fire was high and 30 meters left. The gunners could not localize the source. The round's detonation point in open water had provided an incomplete position fix, and the launcher's minimal acoustic and visual signature had given them nothing else to triangulate from. Macaraeg was already adjusting. He elevated the bipod's front leg by approximately 2 centimeters. A small mechanical change that added 6 or 7 meters of range at his firing angle. He loaded the second charge, with the unhurried motion of a man from whom anxiety has been displaced entirely by procedure. He pulled the cord. The second round landed at the forward edge of the berm, not inside the Japanese position, but close enough that 3 Japanese soldiers moving along the communication trench immediately behind the berm went flat and remained there for several seconds. The Type 92 heavy machine gun crew at the eastern bunker, visible now as defined shapes at their aperture, traversed the weapon toward Macaraeg's side of the paddy and fired another long burst. The tracer rounds cut through the mist 30 meters left of his position. They still could not find him. To Macaraeg's right, the Filipino rifle element read the engagement without instruction and acted on it. They had been watching for the machine gun to commit to a fixed direction. It had. 38 riflemen surged forward through the paddy water, using the Japanese gun's engagement of Macaraeg's position as cover for their own movement across the open ground. No written plan had anticipated this. It was the collective tactical instinct of men who had been fighting long enough to recognize and exploit a developing opportunity without waiting to be told. The third round was direct. The firing elevation, the accumulated range correction from 2 adjustments, and the trajectory geometry of the bamboo tube combined with the angle of the eastern bunker's gun aperture to deliver the round through the aperture opening at a steep descent. The round detonated inside the bunker. The sound was categorically different from the previous 2. A confined, pressurized crack followed immediately by secondary concussion as the sandbag walls redirected blast energy inward rather than outward. The Type 92 went silent. Corporal Reyes, in his 1946 account, said, "When the big gun stopped, I thought maybe it was reloading. Then it stayed quiet. And I thought, that is different. That is something different." From the Japanese perspective, reconstructed later through prisoner interrogations, conducted in April 1945, the third round produced immediate organizational disorientation. The garrison had been prepared for infantry assault across the paddy. What they were experiencing was an indirect fire weapon of unrecognized type, firing from an unlocated position, with a trajectory profile and detonation pattern that corresponded to nothing in their threat assessment categories. The garrison commander, Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, ordered one of the light machine gun crews repositioned from the southern spider holes to reinforce the damaged eastern bunker. The movement required crossing 30 meters of open communication trench. McCraig's fourth round intercepted them in the trench. He had walked his fire deliberately, watching each round's impact and estimating lateral correction from the plume geometry. The fourth round was slightly off-center from the trench junction, but close enough. 2 soldiers were killed by fragmentation. 1 was wounded. The repositioning order disintegrated. The surviving soldiers reversed course. By this point, the Filipino rifle element had crossed the first 80 meters of paddy and was still moving. Sergeant Lara, advancing with the assault line, shouted back across the open water, "Dodong, right bunker, right bunker." The second machine gun position, the Type 92 emplacement inside the northern warehouse bunker, had opened fire on the advancing riflemen. McCraig pivoted the bipod. He estimated the new range at approximately 155 meters. He loaded his 5th charge using the heavier propellant casing variant he had prepared specifically for engagements beyond 130 meters, elevated the bipod front leg an additional 3 centimeters, and aligned his firing arc on the warehouse aperture. He had 2 attempts before the rifle element ran out of the time and distance available to them in the open water. If both rounds missed, the Type 92 would cut through the advancing men before they reached the berm. The 5th round fell 15 meters short. The heavy machine gun kept firing. McCraig loaded the 6th charge. His hands, according to Santos, who was watching from 5 meters away, did not shake. The 6th round struck 3 meters short of the warehouse bunker's front face, not inside it, but the combined blast pressure and fragmentation from a near miss at that angle swept through the gun aperture from outside, temporarily disabling the weapon crew. The Type 92 went silent for 40 seconds. 40 seconds was enough. The leading Filipino rifleman reached the irrigation berm during those 40 seconds and crossed it. Once men are inside a fixed defensive position, the geometry of fortification inverts against the defenders. The bunkers become obstacles. The communication trenches become channeled killing corridors, and the prepared fields of fire point outward at empty ground rather than inward at the threat. The Japanese garrison, designed to resist external pressure, had no coherent answer for infantry already inside the wire. The 7th round, fired by McCraig on his own initiative without instruction, targeted the cluster of Japanese soldiers attempting to withdraw from the collapsed spider hole network toward the warehouse bunker, caught in the open ground between the 2 positions at the moment of maximum exposure. The round landed in the middle of the movement. 4 soldiers were killed. 6 more scattered in separate directions. The coordinated withdrawal ceased to be coordinated. The eastern defensive corridor fell in 11 minutes from the first round, not through superior firepower and not through weight of numbers, but through the systematic disruption of every coordinated response the garrison attempted. Each time the Japanese repositioned a weapon, McCraig put a round into the path of the repositioning. Each time they attempted to reinforce a failing sector, the reinforcement arrived degraded or not at all. The corridor's carefully engineered architecture, designed to absorb frontal pressure from a known direction, had no contingency for indirect fire from an unlocated source, operated by a man who had spent months learning the mathematics of bamboo and elevation and air. The Filipino riflemen who cleared the berm and worked through the forward bunkers found, in one of the fighting positions, a Japanese field notebook whose contents were translated in April 1945. In the entries covering the morning of March 14, in a notation that may have been written during the engagement itself, a single phrase appeared: "Unknown indirect fire, small caliber, highly accurate, Unknown indirect fire. Rodrigo Macaraeg, when shown the translation, reportedly said nothing. He folded the paper and placed it in his shirt pocket. He had one prepared charge remaining. He had not wasted what he built. The battle for Barangay Sto Tomas did not end at the eastern corridor. The remaining Japanese garrison, approximately 200 soldiers still holding the central and western sections of the village, mounted a determined defense for another 6 hours before a coordinated afternoon assault, conducted by Filipino companies now advancing through the breached eastern corridor, drove the position to full collapse. By 4 p.m. on March 14, Sto Tomas was in Philippine Commonwealth Army hands. The accounting was unambiguous. The two previous assault attempts, March 8 and March 11, had produced 33 combined Filipino casualties and 0 territorial gain. The March 14 operation, initiated by Macaraeg's 7 rounds, produced 12 Filipino casualties and the complete capture of a fortified position that regimental intelligence had assessed as requiring dedicated artillery or air support to reduce. Lieutenant Colonel Reyes came forward to the eastern berm within an hour of the position's fall. He walked the trench line without speaking. He examined each bunker in sequence. He stood for a long time at the aperture of the eastern machine gun emplacement, where the 3rd round had entered, looking at the interior, looking at the aperture dimensions, looking at the trajectory angle required to deliver a round through an opening that size from a firing position he could not directly see. Then he walked back to where Macaraeg was sitting on an upended ammunition crate, running a cloth-wrapped bamboo rod through the interior of the launcher tube. Reyes examined the launcher for a long moment. "How many tubes do you have?" he asked. "1," Macaraeg said. "How many can you build? With the right bamboo, 3 or 4 more. With enough wire and enough casings, maybe 6. Reyes turned to his executive officer. "Get him whatever he needs. Casings, wire, tools, and men if he asks for them." Captain Domingo submitted a written request that same evening for Macaraeg to be formally recognized as the unit's weapons development specialist, a designation that did not exist within the Philippine Commonwealth Army's official table of organization, but which Reyes approved by direct command authority, the way that every field expedient change to military structure has always been made, with a pen, in a notebook, without waiting for the bureaucracy to catch up. The story moved through the regiment faster than the official after-action report could. By the evening of March 14, soldiers from units that had not been at Sto Tomas were asking about Dodong's bamboo mortar. By March 16, a patrol from a neighboring battalion had arrived at the 14th Infantry's position, specifically requesting that the weapons specialist provide construction instruction. By March 20, Macaraeg had trained 14 soldiers from 3 different units in the fabrication and operation of what was now informally designated the Macaraeg projector. Captain Domingo, in the same 1946 oral history interview where Sergeant Lara had described Macaraeg as a man always touching things, like a mechanic looking at a broken engine, was asked directly what had passed through his mind when the eastern corridor fell on the morning of March 14. He was silent for a long moment before answering. "I thought," he said, "that I had almost stopped something important." Rodrigo Dodong Macaraeg was promoted to sergeant in April 1945 and served with the 14th Infantry Regiment through the formal Japanese surrender in September of that year. He returned afterward to Lore, Nueva Ecija, where he resumed farming on the same tenant land his father had worked before him. He is not among the decorated veterans in any standard account of the Philippine Liberation Campaign. His name appears in no monument. The Macaraeg projector was never formally adopted, never officially designated, and never catalogued in any military inventory. But in the oral history of the 14th Infantry, in the accounts gathered by researchers during the 1970s and 1980s, when the surviving veterans were old men who had been carrying the story in their memories for 30 years, his name surfaces again and again, always attached to the same morning, the same mist, the same flooded paddy, the same 4-foot tube set 42 degrees on a handmade bipod. The details remain consistent across decades of telling, the way only true stories stay consistent. The Japanese soldiers who had spent 3 years across the Philippine archipelago, cataloging improvised Filipino resistance as the predictable desperation of an outgunned force, encountered something different on the morning of March 14, 1945. They encountered a man who had been told he had nothing, no rank, no authority, no credentials, no place in any official plan, and who had responded to that assessment by spending 7 months building something out of what the forest provided, until the thing he built was undeniable. No one ever doubted him again.